Sometimes the most broken people find each other when they need healing most. There's something powerful about a man who's lost everything, deciding that one person's safety matters more than his own peace. Gutter Jack lived alone in the Colorado mountains for 15 years, wanting nothing from the world below. When the trading post sent up a woman to cook his meals, he told her straight she was there to work, nothing more. But when he saw the dark bruises on her arms, everything changed. That night, he rode down from his mountain with his rifle and a fire in his gut. Her tormentor disappeared from the saloon and was never seen again. Jack never spoke of what happened in town, but when he returned, he carved her name in the hearthstone beside his own. What happens when the most dangerous man in the territory decides that protecting someone means becoming the very thing he's tried to forget? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind cut through the pines like a blade, carrying the scent of snow and something harder to name. The kind of loneliness that settles into a man's bones after too many years of choosing solitude over company. Cutter Jack stood on the porch of his cabin, watching the trail that wound down through the aspens toward Copper Falls, 3 miles below and a lifetime away from where he'd made his peace with being forgotten. His real name was Jackson Cutler, though few remembered that now. The years had a way of stripping a man down to what mattered. And what mattered about Jack was simple. He was dangerous when crossed, reliable when trusted, and had earned his nickname the hard way during the range wars of '82. The story went that he'd cut down 7 men in a single fight, defending a homesteader's family from claim jumpers. Whether it was true or not depended on who told it, but Jack never corrected the tales. Sometimes a reputation served a man better than the truth. The cabin he'd built with his own hands sat nestled in a clearing halfway up Widow's Peak, surrounded by timber so thick a man could disappear into it and never be found. Jack had chosen this spot deliberately, not just for the protection it offered, but for the way it let him see trouble coming from 3 directions. The 4th direction, straight up the mountain face, was too steep for anything but eagles and the occasional mountain goat. Inside, the cabin told the story of a man who'd learned to live with only what he needed. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, built from river rock he'd hauled up the mountain himself. The hearth stretched wide enough to heat the main room, with space above for drying meat and warming boots. To one side sat a simple wooden table, scarred from years of use, where he took his meals and cleaned his weapons. 2 chairs faced each other across that table, though only one had seen regular use in the 15 years since he'd built this place. The kitchen area occupied one corner, a cast-iron stove, shelves lined with mason jars filled with preserved vegetables and meat, and a hand pump that drew water from the well he'd dug behind the cabin. Everything was organized with military precision, each item in its place and purpose clear. This was how Jack had learned to live, with intention without waste, and always ready to move if circumstances demanded it. His bedroom was sparse, a simple bed frame he'd crafted from pine, a trunk that held his few possessions, and a gun rack mounted on the wall where he kept his rifles. The Winchester 30-30 he used for hunting hung there alongside a newer Marlin 45-70, a gift from his old commanding officer before the man died of consumption 3 winters back. Below them, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the Colt 45 that had seen him through the war and the troubles that followed. The war. Jack rarely let his mind wander back to those days, but sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, memory would creep in like fog through the trees. He'd been a different man then, younger, angrier, carrying the weight of watching too many good men die for causes that seemed less clear with each passing year. When the fighting ended, he'd tried to go home to Missouri, tried to pick up the pieces of the life he'd left behind. But home had changed, or maybe he had. Either way, it hadn't worked. He drifted west like so many others, looking for something he couldn't name. found work as a sheriff's deputy in a town that needed someone willing to face down the kind of men who settled disputes with iron rather than words. That was where he'd met Sarah. Sarah Whitmore had been the schoolteacher, a woman with gentle hands and a spine of steel who could calm a room full of children with a look and stand up to the town drunk with equal ease. She'd seen something in Jack worth saving, and for 3 years he'd believed she was right. They'd planned a life together, a house on the edge of town, children running through a garden she'd plant behind the kitchen, simple dreams that seemed possible when she smiled at him across the dinner table. Then came the fever that swept through the valley in the spring of '78. Sarah was one of the first to fall sick, one of the last to let go. Jack sat beside her bed for 6 days, helpless as the woman who'd brought light to his world, faded like a candle in the wind. When she died, something in him died with her, and he'd known with terrible clarity that he was never meant for the settled life she'd offered him. He'd left town the day after her funeral, riding up into the mountains with no plan except to get far enough away from other people's lives that he couldn't hurt them or they couldn't hurt him. The cabin he'd built here was meant to be temporary, just a place to winter while he figured out what came next. 15 years later, he was still figuring. The isolation suited him mostly. He hunted for meat, fished the streams for trout, and grew enough vegetables in his small garden to supplement what he preserved each fall. Once a month, he rode down to Copper Falls for supplies, coffee, salt, ammunition, and the occasional letter from his sister back east. He kept to himself, spoke only when spoken to, and had cultivated a reputation that kept most folks from bothering him with their troubles. Most folks, but not all. Every few months, someone would make the climb up to his cabin, usually desperate people with problems they couldn't solve themselves. A stolen horse, missing cattle, or worse. Jack had a policy about such visits. He listened to what they had to say, decided whether their trouble was worth his time, and either helped or sent them on their way. He never asked for payment, but most left something anyway. Salt pork, ammunition, or news from the world below. The trading post in Copper Falls had been sending him supplies for the better part of a decade, delivered by whoever was willing to make the climb for a few extra dollars. Usually it was Tommy Brennan, a young man with more enthusiasm than sense, who treated the monthly supply run like an adventure. But Tommy had taken sick with a lung fever, and old Henrik Olsen, who ran the trading post, had been forced to find someone else willing to make the journey. That was how Jack found himself expecting a visitor this grey October morning, watching the trail for whoever Henrik had convinced to take over Tommy's route. He'd been specific in his requirements, someone reliable, someone who wouldn't get lost on the mountain, and someone who understood that his business was his own. The last thing he needed was some chatty newcomer trying to make conversation or asking questions about why a man would choose to live so far from civilization. The sound of hoofbeats on the trail below caught his attention, and Jack stepped to the edge of the porch for a better view. Through the gaps in the trees, he could make out a single rider leading a pack horse, moving steadily up the switchbacks with the careful pace of someone who knew mountain trails. As they drew closer, he realized Henrik's replacement wasn't what he'd expected. It was a woman. She rode a bay mare with the easy confidence of someone raised around horses, keeping the pack animal on a short lead as they navigated the rocky sections of trail. Even at this distance, Jack could see she was young, maybe 25 or 30, with dark hair pulled back under a worn hat and clothes that spoke of hard work rather than vanity. She sat straight in the saddle, alert but not nervous, as if she'd ridden these mountains before. Jack felt a familiar tension settle in his shoulders. Women meant complications, and complications were exactly what he'd come up here to avoid. He'd have to make it clear from the start that this arrangement was strictly business. She could deliver his supplies, take whatever payment Henrik had arranged, and head back down the mountain. No conversation, no questions, and definitely no attempts to civilize him or improve his living situation. As the rider crested the final rise and entered his clearing, Jack got his first clear look at Henrik's choice of replacement. She was prettier than he'd expected, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that missed nothing as they took in his cabin, his defensive position on the porch, and the rifle he kept within easy reach. But there was something else in those eyes, a wariness that spoke of hard experience, the kind that came from learning not to trust too quickly or completely. She reined in her horse about 10 feet from the porch, close enough to talk, but far enough away to run if necessary. Smart. Jack appreciated caution in anyone who dealt with him, especially someone who didn't know his reputation yet, Mr. Cutler. Her voice was clear and steady, with just a hint of the South in the way she shaped his name. "I'm Elena Vasquez. Henrik Olsen sent me up with your supplies." Jack nodded, studying her face for signs of the curiosity or fear he usually saw in newcomers. She showed neither, just professional courtesy and a readiness to get on with business. Maybe this wouldn't be as complicated as he'd feared. "Tommy's still sick, I take it," he said, stepping down from the porch to help with the pack horse. "Lung fever. Doc says he'll be laid up another month at least." She dismounted with fluid grace, already moving to untie the supplies from the pack animal. "Henrik thought you might prefer steady delivery over waiting for Tommy to recover." Henrik thought right. Jack took the first bundle of supplies, noting that she'd packed everything exactly as he'd specified in his orders. "You know these trails?" "I've ridden them before. My family had a place down in Willow Creek before." She stopped herself, as if she'd said more than intended. "Before I came to work for the trading post. There was a story there, Jack could tell, but it wasn't his business unless she made it his business." He finished unloading the supplies in comfortable silence, appreciating that she didn't feel the need to fill every quiet moment with chatter. When they were done, he retrieved the payment Henrik had specified from inside his cabin, enough to cover the supplies, plus a fair wage for the dangerous ride up the mountain. "Tell Henrik the arrangement suits me," Jack said, pressing the money into her hand. "Same time next month?" "If that works for you." Elena mounted her horse with the same easy grace she'd shown dismounting. "He wanted me to ask if you need anything special for winter." Last chance before the heavy snows, Jack considered this. He was well prepared for winter, as always. But there were a few items that would make the long months more comfortable. Extra coffee beans if he can get them. And lamp oil. Other than that, the usual will do. She nodded, touching the brim of her hat, in a gesture that was somehow both respectful and independent. "I'll tell him. Good day, Mr. Cutler. Miss Vasquez." Jack watched her guide her horses back toward the trail, noting the way she sat alert in the saddle, eyes moving constantly to check her surroundings. Whatever had brought her to this work, she'd learned to take care of herself. As the sound of hoofbeats faded down the mountain, Jack returned to his cabin with the strange feeling that something had shifted in his carefully ordered world. Elena Vasquez seemed capable and professional, exactly what he needed in someone who would be making regular trips to his sanctuary. But there had been something in her eyes, that deep wariness he recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror for years. Whatever story lay behind those careful, guarded expressions wasn't his concern. He had supplies to put away, winter preparations to complete, and a life of deliberate solitude to maintain. If Henrik's new delivery woman could do her job without bringing complications to his mountain, that was all that mattered. But as Jack stacked the supplies in his cabin, he found himself thinking about the way she'd controlled her horse with gentle authority, the careful way she'd approached his porch, and the hint of sadness in her voice when she'd mentioned her family's place in Willow Creek. Despite his best intentions, Cutter Jack was curious about Elena Vasquez, and curiosity was a luxury he'd learned long ago he couldn't afford. November came to the mountains like a promise of hard times ahead, bringing with it the kind of cold that settled into a man's joints and reminded him that winter didn't ask permission to arrive. Jack had spent the morning checking his traps along the North Ridge, finding them empty except for one sorry rabbit that would barely make a meal. The hunting had been poor this season, game driven deeper into the high country by something that kept them spooked and moving. He was splitting firewood behind the cabin when he heard the hoofbeats, too early for Elena's. Regular delivery and moving too fast for a casual rider. Jack set down his axe and moved to where he could see the trail, his hand automatically checking the colt at his hip. In 15 years on this mountain, unexpected visitors had brought nothing but trouble. Elena's bay mare came into view first, lathered with sweat and breathing hard from the climb. But it was the way she sat in the saddle that told Jack something was wrong. Hunched forward, favoring her left side, moving with the careful stiffness of someone fighting pain. As she drew closer, he could see the torn sleeve of her coat and the dark stain that could only be blood. She barely managed to dismount before her legs gave out, and Jack found himself moving faster than he had in years to catch her before she hit the ground. Up close, he could see the pallor of her face and the way her breath came short and shallow. Someone had hurt her, and recently. "Easy now," Jack said, supporting her weight as he guided her toward the cabin. "Let's get you inside where I can see what's been done to you." Elena didn't argue, which told him more about her condition than words could have. The Elena Vasquez he'd met a month ago would have insisted she was fine, would have tried to handle whatever this was on her own. The fact that she was letting him help meant she was in worse shape than she wanted to admit. Inside the cabin, Jack settled her into the chair nearest the fire and began examining her injuries with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd tended battlefield wounds. The cut on her arm was deep but clean, the kind made by a sharp knife rather than an accident. Her ribs were bruised, possibly cracked, and there were finger marks on her throat that made something cold and dangerous settle in Jack's chest. "Who did this to you?" His voice was quiet, controlled, but Elena must have heard something in it that made her look up sharply. "It doesn't matter. It's over now." She tried to sit straighter, wincing as the movement pulled at her injured ribs. "I just need to rest for a minute, then I'll be on my way." Jack continued, cleaning the knife wound, noting the defensive nature of it. She'd tried to protect herself, fought back. "This isn't over. Someone hurt you deliberate and hurt you bad. That's not something a man just walks away from. Please." There was something desperate in her voice now, a fear that went deeper than physical pain. "Just let me rest and I'll be gone before morning. You don't need to get involved in this." But Jack was already involved, had been from the moment he'd caught her falling from her horse. He'd spent 15 years avoiding other people's troubles, but this wasn't other people. This was Eleanor, who rode the dangerous mountain trails alone to bring him supplies, who treated him with respect rather than fear, who had never once tried to pry into his business or change his ways. "Tell me what happened," he said, finishing with her arm and moving to check her ribs. "Start from the beginning." Elena was quiet for so long that Jack thought she might refuse to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There's a man in Copper Falls, Reese Tolliver. He owns the Silver Dollar Saloon and thinks he owns anyone who works for him." She paused, taking a careful breath. "Henrik hired me to help with the trading post, but Tolliver decided I belonged to him instead." Jack's hand stilled on her ribs. He knew the name. Reese Tolliver had a reputation that reached even up to his mountain sanctuary. The man had come to Copper Falls 5 years ago with money and an attitude, buying up businesses and people with equal ease. The kind of man who took what he wanted and used fear to keep it. He made his intentions clear from the start, Elena continued. "But I told him I wasn't interested. Henrik tried to protect me, said I worked for him, and that was that. But Tolliver doesn't take no for an answer. So he hurt you." "It wasn't a question. He cornered me behind the trading post this morning. Said if I wouldn't come willing, he'd take what he wanted anyway." Elena's voice hardened. "I had my skinning knife. Cut him good across the hand when he grabbed me. That's when he really got angry." Jack could picture it. A small woman with a knife facing down a man like Tolliver, brave enough to fight but not strong enough to win. The image made something dark and familiar wake up in his chest, something he'd kept buried for 15 years. He told me if I ever came back to town, he'd finish what he started. He said he had friends who'd make sure I understood my place. Elena met Jack's eyes, and he saw the fear there, not of Tolliver, but of what she was asking. "I can't go back, Mr. Cutler. I've got nowhere else to go." Jack finished examining her ribs, confirming they were bruised but not broken. The physical injuries would heal, but the fear in her eyes was something else entirely. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror during the months after Sarah died, when he'd realized that some wounds went too deep for time to touch. "You can stay here tonight," he said, moving to bank the fire and put water on to boil. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning. I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm telling." Jack's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You're hurt, it's getting dark, and the trail down is dangerous enough in daylight. You'll stay?" Elena nodded, sinking back into the chair with visible relief. But Jack could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, already trying to figure out how to solve this problem on her own. She didn't understand yet that Rhys Tolliver had made a mistake when he put his hands on her. Some men might let that pass, might figure it wasn't their business as long as it didn't happen on their land. Jack wasn't some men. He prepared a simple meal while Elena dozed fitfully in the chair, noting the way she startled at every small sound and kept one hand near the knife at her belt even in sleep. She was tough, tougher than most men he'd known, but toughness only went so far against a man like Tolliver. What she needed was someone willing to speak a language that men like Tolliver understood. As the evening wore on, Jack found himself studying Elena's face in the firelight, seeing past the bruises to the strength underneath. She reminded him of Sarah in some ways, not in looks, but in the way she carried herself, the quiet dignity that no amount of brutality could break. The thought should have been painful, should have sent him retreating into the careful numbness he'd cultivated over the years. Instead, it made him angry. Tolliver thought he could hurt Elena and walk away, thought that a woman with no family and no protection was fair game for whatever he wanted to do. The man had probably forgotten about her already, moved on to planning his next conquest, while she sat here trying to figure out how to survive. Jack hadn't forgotten how to make men remember their mistakes. When Elena finally woke, the fire had burned low, and Jack was sitting across from her, cleaning his colt with the methodical precision of a man preparing for work. She watched him for a long moment, something changing in her expression as she recognized what she was seeing. "You're thinking about going down there," she said. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking about a lot of things." Jack held the revolver up to the light, checking the action. "Mostly I'm thinking about how a man like Tolliver needs to learn that some actions have consequences. He's not alone down there. He's got men who work for him, men who won't hesitate to kill if he tells them to." Jack looked at her then, and Elena saw something in his eyes that made her understand why people called him Cutter Jack, why his reputation kept trouble away from his mountain. "Miss Vasquez, I've been killing men like Tolliver since before you were born. The only question is whether you want him to know why he's dying, or if you'd prefer he just disappear." The cabin fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. Elena stared at him, seeing past the quiet mountain man she'd known to the dangerous truth underneath. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I want him to know." Dawn came gray and cold to the mountain, with the kind of mist that clung to the trees like smoke from a dying fire. Jack had been awake for hours, sitting by the window and watching the trail, while Elena slept in his bed. The first time in 15 years another person had used it. He'd taken the floor, wrapped in blankets near the fire, but sleep had been elusive. His mind kept turning over what needed to be done, calculating distances and timing, remembering skills he'd hoped never to use again. Elena stirred as the first pale light filtered through the cabin windows, sitting up carefully and testing her injuries with the cautious movements of someone learning to live with pain. The bruises on her face had darkened overnight, painting her cheek in shades of purple and yellow that made Jack's jaw tighten with fresh anger. "How do you feel?" he asked, not turning from the window. "Like I've been trampled by a horse." Elena swung her legs over the side of the bed, wincing as the movement pulled at her ribs. "But I'll live, thanks to you." Jack finally looked at her, taking note of the way she held herself and the clarity in her eyes. She was hurt but healing, which was good. What he had planned would require her to be strong enough to travel. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said, moving to poke life back into the fire. Tolliver thinks he's won, thinks you'll either run scared or come crawling back begging for mercy. He's not expecting trouble, which gives us an advantage. Us. Elena's voice carried a note of surprise. Mr. Cutler, I can't ask you to... You didn't ask. I offered. Jack set a pot of coffee on the stove, going through his morning routine with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. But if we're going to do this, we do it right. That means you tell me everything about Tolliver, where he goes, who he trusts, what his habits are. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the growing light. You're really going to kill him, aren't you? That depends on him. Jack measured coffee into the pot with steady hands. I'm going to have a conversation with Mr. Tolliver about the proper way to treat a lady. If he's smart, he'll listen. If he's not, Jack shrugged. Well, stupid men don't tend to live long in this country. As they shared breakfast, Eleanor began to talk. She told him about Tolliver's routines, how he spent most evenings in his saloon, holding court with the men who worked for him. She described the layout of the Silver Dollar, the back rooms where Tolliver conducted his private business, and the small army of hired guns who made sure nobody challenged his authority in Copper Falls. He's got maybe 6 men who work for him regular, Elena said, cradling her coffee cup for warmth. But there's others who'll side with him if trouble starts. The sheriff's in his pocket, and the mayor owes him money. If you ride into town looking for a fight, you'll be outnumbered and outgunned. Jack listened without comment, filing away every detail. He'd faced worse odds during the war, but that had been different. Official orders, clear objectives, and the backing of the Union Army. This was personal, which made it both more dangerous and more important. What about his weaknesses? Jack asked. Every man's got something that scares him, something he can't control. Elena considered this. Pride, I think. He hates being shown up, especially in front of his men. He came to Copper Falls as the big man from back east, and he needs everyone to believe he's untouchable. Good. Pride makes men stupid. Jack refilled their coffee cups, already forming the outline of a plan. Tell me about the town itself. Who's friendly to you, who might help if things go wrong? Henrik, but he's got a family to protect. The doctor might patch you up if you needed it. He's got no love for Tolliver after what happened to the Murphy girl last spring. Elena's voice darkened. I'm not the first woman Tolliver's hurt, just the first one who fought back and lived to tell about it. That piece of information settled something cold and final in Jack's chest. Men like Tolliver were a disease that spread if left untreated, poisoning everything they touched until decent people learned to look the other way rather than risk becoming victims themselves. He'd seen it during the war, in the aftermath, when carpetbaggers and outlaws filled the vacuum left by destroyed institutions. We'll leave this afternoon, Jack said, rising to check his weapons. I want to get into town after dark, when Tolliver's settled into his usual routine. You want me to come with you? Elena looked surprised and a little frightened. I thought you'd want me to stay here out of the way. I need you there, Jack said, checking the action on his Winchester. Tolliver needs to see your face when he realizes what's coming for him. Besides, running away teaches men like him that they can do whatever they want, as long as they scare their victims badly enough. Elena nodded slowly, understanding the logic even if it frightened her. What exactly are you planning to do? Jack paused in his weapon inspection, considering how much to tell her. The truth was that he didn't have a complete plan yet, too. Much depended on what they found when they reached Copper Falls, but the broad strokes were clear enough. I'm going to walk into the Silver Dollar saloon and have a conversation with Reese Tolliver about his behavior toward... Ladies, Jack said, what happens after that depends entirely on how that conversation goes, and if his men try to stop you, then they'll learn why people call me Cutter Jack. His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. The important thing is that you'll be safe. After tonight, Tolliver won't be bothering you or any other woman ever again. Elena studied his face, seeing the quiet certainty there. She'd heard stories about Cutter Jack, whispered tales of a man who could appear and disappear like smoke, who settled disputes with a speed and finality that left no room for argument. Looking at him now, preparing his weapons with the calm efficiency of a craftsman preparing his tools, she began to believe those stories might be true. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "You could just let me right away go back to your life up here. Why risk yourself for someone you barely know?" Jack was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if it might hold answers to questions he'd been avoiding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and older regrets. 15 years ago, I lost someone I should have protected. I told myself then that the world was too hard and too cruel for one man to make a difference, that the smart thing was to look after yourself and let other people fight their own battles. He looked at Eleanor, and she saw something vulnerable in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Maybe I was wrong. Maybe some battles are worth fighting, even if you can't win them all." Elena felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Here was a man who'd isolated himself from the world to avoid causing or experiencing pain, and he was willing to risk everything to help her face down her demons. The magnitude of that gift wasn't lost on her. "Thank you," she said simply. Jack nodded, returning to his preparations. "We'll see if you still want to thank me after tonight." The afternoon sun was already fading behind the western peaks when Jack and Eleanor set out from the cabin, their horses picking their way carefully down the mountain trail in the gathering dusk. Jack had chosen the timing deliberately, late enough that full darkness would cloak their arrival in Copper Falls, but early enough that the saloons would still be busy with their evening crowd. Elena rode beside him in silence, her face pale but determined under the brim of her hat. Jack had offered her the chance to change her mind a dozen times during their preparations, but she'd refused each time with the quiet stubbornness of someone who'd made peace with a difficult decision. She wore her heaviest coat to hide the knife wound on her arm, and Jack had given her one of his spare revolvers, a Smith & Wesson .38 that she handled with the competence of someone raised around firearms. "Tell me about the layout one more time," Jack said as they descended through a grove of aspens, their golden leaves rustling like whispered warnings in the evening breeze. "Main Street runs east to west through the center of town," Elena recited, her voice steady despite the fear Jack could see in her eyes. "The Silver Dollar sits right in the middle, 2 stories with Tolliver's private rooms upstairs. There's a back entrance through the alley, but he keeps it locked and usually has someone watching it." Jack nodded, filing away the information. He'd been to Copper Falls before, but not often, and never with violence in mind. Tonight would be different. Tonight he was going as a predator, not a customer. "The men he keeps close are Lou Brennan and Jim Castellanos," Elena continued. "Lou's big and slow but handy with a shotgun. Jim's fast with a pistol but drinks too much and gets careless. There's usually 4 or 5 others around, but they're more for show than real fighting." "What about the sheriff?" "Pete Morrison. He owes Tolliver money and knows which side his bread is buttered on. He'll side with Tolliver if it comes to shooting, but he's not much of a fighter himself." Jack absorbed this, building a mental map of the obstacles he'd face. 7 or 8 men, possibly more if things went badly. In his younger days, he might have relished the challenge, might have seen it as a chance to prove his skills against worthy opponents. Now he understood that the point wasn't to prove anything, it was to end the threat to Elena with as little risk as possible. As they rode deeper into the foothills, Elena began to tell him more about her life before Copper Falls. Her family had indeed owned a small ranch in Willow Creek, until Apache raids and drought had driven them out 3 years ago. Her parents had died during the exodus east, her father from a fever and her mother from the grief that followed. Elena had been alone ever since, working whatever job she could find and saving money for a new start somewhere far from the memories. "I thought Copper Falls might be different," she said, her voice carrying the weight of disappointed hopes. "Henrik seemed decent and the work was honest. I should have known better than to think I could just disappear into a new life." "You weren't wrong to hope," Jack said. "You were just unlucky enough to run into a man who thinks he can take whatever he wants." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the mountain evening settling around them like a familiar blanket. Jack found himself stealing glances at Elena, noting the way she sat her horse and the careful way she scanned their surroundings for danger. She was tougher than she looked, tougher than she probably knew herself. The thought that Tolliver had tried to break that spirit filled Jack with a cold anger that went deeper than simple justice. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said, as they paused to rest their horses at a creek crossing. "Go ahead. Back at the cabin, you said you lost someone you should have protected. Was that during the war?" Jack was quiet for so long that Elena thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful tone of a man handling painful memories. Her name was Sarah Whitmore. She was a school teacher in a town called Cedar Ridge, where I worked as a deputy sheriff after the war. Jack loosened his horse's girth and let the animal drink from the clear water. "We were going to be married, had plans for a house and children, and all the things people plan when they think they have forever." Elena waited, sensing there was more to the story. Fever came through the valley in the spring of '78, killed near half the town before it burned itself out. Jack's hands stilled on his horse's neck. "Sarah was one of the last to go. I sat by her bed for 6 days, helpless as a newborn while she slipped away. All my guns and all my fighting skills, and I couldn't do a damn thing to save the one person who mattered most." "That wasn't your fault," Elena said gently. "Maybe not. But I should have been there for her from the start. Should have married her when she first said yes, instead of waiting for the right time." Jack tightened his horse's girth with sharp, precise movements. "Instead, I let my fear of settling down, of being responsible for someone else's happiness, keep me from giving her the life she deserved." Elena understood now why Jack had isolated himself on the mountain, why he'd spent 15 years avoiding attachments that might lead to loss. But she also understood why he was willing to risk himself for her. This was his chance to be the protector he'd failed to be for Sarah. "She sounds like she was lucky to have you." "Even for a little while," Elena said. "I was the lucky one." Jack mounted his horse and waited for Elena to do the same. "Sarah saw something in me worth saving. Took me 15 years to figure out she might have been right." As they resumed their journey toward Copper Falls, the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared overhead. Jack could feel the familiar weight of his weapons, the cold focus that always came before violence. But this time was different. This time he wasn't fighting for duty or survival, but for something more precious and more fragile. The lights of Copper Falls appeared below them as they crested the final ridge, scattered like fallen stars across the valley floor. Somewhere down there, Reese Tolliver was probably holding court in his saloon, secure in his power, and confident that his assault on Elena would have no consequences. "Ready?" Jack asked, checking his weapons one final time. Elena took a deep breath, her hand moving unconsciously to the knife at her belt. "Ready!" They rode down toward the lights of town, two figures moving through the darkness with the quiet purpose of judgment coming to call. Behind them, the mountain stood silent and watchful, holding its secrets close, while the wind sang through the pines like a funeral dirge for the violence to come. Copper Falls at night was a different creature than during the day. The respectable businesses had shuttered their windows and locked their doors, leaving the streets to those who found their entertainment in whiskey, cards, and the kind of company that didn't ask too many questions. Yellow light spilled from the saloons onto the muddy main street, mixing with the sounds of rough laughter and off-key piano music to create the particular atmosphere of a frontier town after dark. Jack and Elena left their horses at the livery stable on the edge of town, paying the sleepy hostler for grain and water without offering their names. Jack had changed into his darkest clothes and left his rifle behind, carrying only his Colt and the skinning knife he wore at his belt. Elena had pulled her hat low over her face and wrapped a scarf around her throat to hide the bruises there. But Jack could see the tension in her shoulders as they walked toward the center of town. "Remember what we discussed," Jack said quietly as they paused in the shadows between two buildings. "You stay behind me and to the left where you can see the room but still reach cover. If shooting starts, you get down and stay down until it's over." Elena nodded, her hand unconsciously checking the revolver Jack had given her. What if someone recognizes me before we're ready? Then we adapt. Jack's voice was calm, matter of fact. I've been in worse situations with less preparation. The important thing is that you don't let fear make your decisions for you. They moved through the back streets toward the Silver Dollar, avoiding the main thoroughfare, where too many eyes might mark their passage. Jack had spent the last hour of their ride studying Elena's description of the town layout, building a mental map of escape routes and defensive positions. Old habits from his military days, but habits that had kept him alive through more conflicts than he cared to remember. The Silver Dollar Saloon sat in the heart of Copper Falls like a spider in its web. 2 stories of weathered wood and painted glass that proclaimed Reese Tolliver's dominance over the town's nightlife. Music and laughter poured from the batwing doors, along with the warm yellow glow of oil lamps and the mixed scents of tobacco, whiskey, and unwashed bodies. Jack counted at least 20 horses tied to the hitching posts outside. A good crowd for a weeknight. Which would work in their favor. He's in there, Elena whispered, pointing to a second-story window where lamplight flickered behind lace curtains. That's his private office. He usually comes down around 9 o'clock to play cards with his men. Jack pulled out his pocket watch, squinting at the face in the dim light from the saloon windows. 8:30. They had time to get into position and study the situation before Tolliver made his appearance. The back alley, Jack said. Show me. They circled around behind the saloon, moving through shadows that smelled of garbage and worse things. The back entrance Elena had described was exactly where she'd said it would be. A heavy wooden door set into the rear wall, with a small window beside it that looked into what appeared to be a storage room. Jack tested the door carefully and found it locked, as expected. There's usually someone watching this door from inside, Elena said. One of Tolliver's men in case of trouble. Jack nodded, already forming a plan. The front entrance was too public, too many witnesses and too many of Tolliver's allies. But the back door offered possibilities for someone willing to be creative. They settled into the shadows beside a stack of empty barrels to wait and observe. Jack used the time to study the building's layout, noting the placement of windows and the way the second floor overhung the alley. If things went wrong, he wanted to know every possible way out of the trap they were walking into. Tell me more about this Lou Brennan, Jack said quietly. The one with the shotgun. He's Tolliver's main enforcer. Big man, maybe 6.5 feet tall and built like a bull. He doesn't talk much, but he doesn't have to. People know his reputation. Elena's voice carried a note of unease. He's the one who held me while Tolliver... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Jack felt that familiar cold anger settle in his chest. Men like Brennan were worse than Tolliver in some ways. They might not have the imagination to conceive of cruelty, but they were perfectly willing to carry it out for someone else. In Jack's experience, such men were dangerous because they felt no guilt about their actions, no hesitation when ordered to hurt the innocent. And the other one? Castellanos. Faster with a gun, but he drinks too much and gets careless. He fancies himself a ladies' man, always trying to impress the saloon girls with stories about how dangerous he is. Elena paused. He was there too in the alley. Laughing while Tolliver... Enough. Jack's voice was gentle but firm. You don't need to relive it. Just tell me what I need to know to recognize them. As they waited, other figures moved through the alley. Drunks looking for a place to relieve themselves. Working girls leading customers to the cribs behind the saloon, and the occasional businessman taking a discreet route to entertainment he didn't want associated with his public reputation. Jack catalogued each face, each movement, building a picture of the Silver Dollar's nighttime ecology. At 5 minutes to 9, the back door opened, and a man stepped out into the alley. He was younger than Jack had expected. Maybe 25, with the kind of mustache that suggested vanity and the kind of swagger that suggested inexperience. He lit a cigarette and leaned against the doorframe, clearly settling in for a long watch. That's not one of Tolliver's usual men, Elena whispered. Must be new. Jack studied the guard, noting the way he held his cigarette, the casual way he scanned the alley, the fact that his gun was still holstered despite being on watch duty. This was someone playing at being dangerous, rather than someone who actually was dangerous, which made him both less threatening and more unpredictable. "When I move, you count to 60 and then follow," Jack said, rising from their hiding place with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. "Remember, behind me and to the left, where you can see but stay safe." Elena watched as Jack seemed to melt into the shadows, moving with a silence that defied his size. She'd heard stories about men who could walk through a forest without disturbing a single leaf, but she'd never believed them until now. Jack approached the guard like smoke given form, and by the time the young man realized he wasn't alone, it was far too late. The guard's cigarette hit the ground and scattered sparks as Jack's arms snaked around his throat, cutting off any cry for help. There was a brief struggle, muffled and violent, and then silence. Jack lowered the unconscious man to the ground and waved Elena forward. "He'll live," Jack said quietly, relieving the guard of his weapons. "But he'll have a headache for a week." The door's open now, time to pay Mr. Tolliver a visit. The storage room behind the silver dollar smelled of stale beer and tobacco, with undertones of something less pleasant that Jack preferred not to identify. Crates and barrels lined the walls, creating shadows deep enough to hide an army, and the muffled sounds of the saloon's evening crowd filtered through the thin walls like distant thunder. Jack moved through the room with the careful precision of a man who understood that one creaking floorboard could turn a surgical strike into a bloodbath. Eleanor followed close behind, her breathing controlled but rapid. Jack could sense her fear, but also her determination. She'd come too far to turn back now, had committed herself to seeing this through, regardless of the consequences. That kind of resolve was dangerous in an amateur, but Jack had seen enough combat to recognize the difference between courage and recklessness. Eleanor had the former, tempered by enough intelligence to follow orders when her life depended on it. The door leading into the main saloon was slightly ajar, offering a narrow view of the room beyond. Jack positioned himself where he could see without being seen, taking in the layout and counting potential threats. The main room was exactly as Eleanor had described, a long bar running along one wall, tables scattered throughout the center, and a staircase leading up to Tolliver's private domain. The crowd was typical for a frontier saloon: cowboys, miners, gamblers, and the kind of men who lived on the margins of society. "There," Eleanor whispered, pointing toward a table near the foot of the stairs where 3 men sat playing cards. "The big one with the beard is Lou Brennan. The one in the fancy vest is Jim Castellanos. I don't recognize the third man." Jack studied Brennan first. A mountain of a man with hands like ham hocks and the kind of scars that spoke of a lifetime of violence. His shotgun leaned against the wall within easy reach, and despite his relaxed posture, his eyes constantly scanned the room with the awareness of a professional. Castellanos was smaller but no less dangerous, with the quick movements and nervous energy of someone who relied on speed rather than strength. The third man was older, perhaps 50, with the pale complexion and soft hands of someone who worked with his mind rather than his body. "The older one might be Morrison, the sheriff," Eleanor said, following Jack's gaze. "He sometimes plays cards with Tolliver's men when he's off duty." That complicated things. A corrupt sheriff was still a sheriff, and killing a lawman, even a crooked one, brought the kind of attention that could follow a man for years. Jack filed the information away and continued his reconnaissance, noting the positions of other potential threats throughout the room. The clock behind the bar showed 9:15, which meant Tolliver would be making his appearance soon. Jack had hoped to catch the man alone in his office, but that plan was looking less viable by the minute. Too many people, too many variables, too much that could go wrong. He was beginning to think they might need to wait for a better opportunity when the sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Tolliver's arrival. Reese Tolliver was not what Jack had expected. Instead of the crude bully he'd imagined, the man who descended those stairs was well-dressed and refined, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from always getting what he wanted. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than most men made in a year, and his movements had the calculated grace of someone always aware of his audience. This was a predator who hunted with charm rather than claws, which made him infinitely more dangerous than a simple brute. "Gentlemen," Tolliver said as he approached the card table, his voice carrying the cultured accent of the eastern cities, "I trust the evening is treating you well?" Jack watched as Tolliver took his seat at the table, noting the way the other men deferred to him despite the casual friendliness of his tone. This was a man accustomed to command, someone who wielded power with the ease of long practice. The hand that reached for his cards bore a fresh bandage, evidence of Eleanor's knife work during their struggle. "That's him," Eleanor whispered, and Jack could hear the fear and hatred warring in her voice. "That's the man who—" "I know." Jack's voice was barely audible, but it carried the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Stay here. No matter what happens, you stay in this room until I come back for you." "But you said—" "I changed my mind." Jack checked his Colt one final time, ensuring the cylinder was fully loaded and the action smooth. "There are too many variables out there, too many ways for this to go wrong. I won't risk you getting hurt because I wanted to make a point about facing your fears." Elena started to protest, but something in Jack's expression stopped her. This wasn't the careful mountain man she'd come to know over the past months, or even the protective figure who'd tended her wounds. This was someone else entirely, someone harder, colder, infinitely more dangerous. For the first time, she truly understood why people called him Cutter Jack. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, you take the horses and ride for the mountain," Jack said. "Don't look back. Don't try to help me, just run. Understand?" Elena nodded, unable to trust her voice. She watched as Jack opened the door and stepped into the saloon's main room, moving with the deliberate pace of a man who had made peace with what he was about to do. The noise of conversation and laughter continued around him, but Elena noticed that several patrons seemed to sense something different in the air, a tension that made them glance around nervously and move their hands closer to their weapons. Jack walked through the crowd like a ghost made flesh, his presence barely registering until he was almost to Tolliver's table. When he finally stopped, standing just close enough to cast a shadow across the cards, the conversation at nearby tables began to die away as people sensed the electricity in the air. "Mr. Tolliver," Jack said, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet, "I believe we need to have a conversation." Tolliver looked up from his cards with the practiced smile of a man accustomed to being approached by strangers seeking favors or intimidated by his reputation. But the smile faltered when he met Jack's eyes, replaced by something that might have been recognition or simply the instinctive fear of prey recognizing a predator. "I'm sorry," Tolliver said, setting down his cards with careful precision. "Do we know each other, Mr. Cutler?" Jack said. "Jackson Cutler, though most folks around here call me Cutter Jack." The effect of that name on the room was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Chairs scraped against floorboards as men positioned themselves for trouble, and more than one hand moved instinctively toward a gun butt. Brennan's massive frame tensed like a coiled spring, while Castellanos's nervous energy ramped up to barely controlled excitement. But it was Tolliver's reaction that told Jack everything he needed to know. The man's face went pale, and his bandaged hand moved unconsciously to his throat, as if he could already feel the noose tightening. He knew who Jack was, knew what his presence here meant, and was already calculating his chances of surviving the next few minutes. "Ah," Tolliver said, his voice steady despite the fear Jack could see in his eyes. "The famous mountain hermit. To what do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" "I think you know why I'm here," Jack said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had faced death often enough to be comfortable in its presence. "The question is whether you want to discuss it like civilized men, or whether we need to take this outside, where there's more room to settle things properly." Tolliver's smile never wavered, but Jack could see the calculation behind his eyes, weighing options, measuring distances, counting allies. The man was dangerous precisely because he was intelligent, the kind of predator who survived by thinking 3 moves ahead of his opponents. "I'm afraid I'm at a disadvantage." "Mr. Cutler," Tolliver said, leaning back in his chair with studied casualness. You seem to think I've given you cause for grievance, but I can't imagine what that might be. I rarely venture up to your mountain retreat, and our paths have never crossed in town. Maybe not my path, Jack said. But you crossed paths with someone under my protection. Someone you hurt badly enough that she came to me bleeding and scared. He let his gaze move to Tolliver's bandaged hand. Though it looks like she gave as good as she got, the mention of Elena brought a flicker of something ugly across Tolliver's features, a flash of the real man beneath the polished exterior. Ah, the Mexican girl. Yes, there was an unfortunate misunderstanding a few days ago. She seemed to think she could refuse a generous offer of employment. The only misunderstanding, Jack said, was you thinking you could put your hands on her without consequences. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Men began shifting positions, some moving toward the exits, while others positioned themselves for a better view of the coming violence. Jack was aware of every movement, every potential threat, but his focus remained fixed on Tolliver. I'm afraid you've been misinformed about the nature of our encounter, Tolliver said, his voice taking on the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to talking his way out of trouble. Miss Vasquez became quite upset when I suggested she might find more lucrative employment here at the Silver Dollar. She attacked me with a knife, completely unprovoked, I assure you. I was forced to defend myself. Jack felt a cold smile tug at the corner of his mouth. Is that the story you're sticking with? It's the truth, Mr. Cutler. Ask Sheriff Morrison. He took my statement himself. Tolliver gestured to the older man at the table, who nodded with the reluctant agreement of someone being paid to remember things a certain way. Strange thing about truth, Jack said. Seems to depend on who's telling it. He took a step closer to the table, noting how Brennan's hand moved toward his shotgun. See, the truth I heard was that you cornered a defenseless woman in an alley, tried to force yourself on her, and when she fought back, you beat her half to death. A sordid fabrication, Tolliver said, but Jack could see sweat beginning to bead on the man's forehead despite his confident tone. The word of a desperate woman against that of a respected businessman. I think any reasonable person would know which version to believe. It was then that Jack heard the voice from the storage room behind him. Elena's voice, clear and strong, despite the fear he could hear underneath. Tell them about the others, Tolliver. Tell them about the Murphy girl and what you did to her last spring. Jack didn't turn around, didn't take his eyes off Tolliver for even a second, but he felt something sink in his chest. Elena was supposed to stay hidden, supposed to remain safe while he handled this business. Her appearance changed everything, put her directly in the line of fire he'd been trying to keep her away from. But Elena kept talking, her voice growing stronger as she stepped into the main room. Tell them about Sarah Collins, who disappeared after she refused your advances. Tell them about Maria Santos, who left town with a broken arm and a face nobody could look at without crying. The effect of Elena's words on the room was immediate and profound. Jack could see recognition in several faces, townspeople who had known these women, who had wondered about their fates, but been too afraid to ask questions. The carefully maintained fiction of Tolliver's respectability began to crack like ice under spring sun. Lies, Tolliver said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. The desperate fantasies of a woman who can't accept that her advances were unwelcome. Show them the bruises on my throat, Eleanor said, unwrapping the scarf she'd worn to hide her injuries. Show them the knife wound on my arm where I cut you when you tried to rape me in the alley behind Henrik's store. The gasps from the crowd were audible now, and Jack could see the shift in mood as people began to see past Tolliver's carefully constructed facade. But he also saw something else, the way Brennan had quietly risen from his chair, the way Castellanos had positioned himself for a clear shot, the way Sheriff Morrison's hand had moved to his gun butt. That's enough, Tolliver said, his mask finally slipping to reveal the predator underneath. Lou, I think Miss Vasquez and her friend have outstayed their welcome. It was the moment Jack had been waiting for, the moment when talking ended and the real business began. But as Brennan reached for his shotgun, something unexpected happened. Henrik Olsen stepped through the saloon's front doors. Followed by 3 other men Jack recognized as respectable merchants from the town. "Before you boys start shooting," Henrik said in his heavily accented voice, "maybe you ought to know that we've been listening to this conversation from outside. Seems like Miss Elena's been telling the truth all along." The old Norwegian's presence changed the dynamic completely. Henrik was well respected in Copper Falls, a man whose word carried weight with the honest citizens who formed the backbone of the community. His public support of Elena's story gave legitimacy to accusations that could no longer be dismissed as the fantasies of a desperate woman. "This is my establishment," Tolliver said, rising from his chair with dangerous calm, "and these people are trespassing. Sheriff Morrison, I want them arrested for disturbing the peace." But Morrison seemed reluctant to act, looking around at the growing crowd of townspeople who had followed Henrik into the saloon. The corrupt lawman was brave enough when he had Tolliver's money and protection behind him, but facing down angry citizens was another matter entirely. That's when Jack noticed the detail that changed everything: the small silver star pinned to Henrik's vest. Barely visible in the lamplight, "Pete Morrison was relieved of his duties this afternoon," Henrik said, following Jack's gaze. "Town council voted unanimously. Seems there were questions about his handling of certain recent crimes." He looked directly at Tolliver. "I'm the new sheriff, at least until we can hold proper elections." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Jack felt his own assumptions reshuffling as he realized this had never been about one man seeking justice for one woman. This was bigger, a coordinated effort by the decent people of Copper Falls to reclaim their town from the predator who had terrorized it for too long. Tolliver's face went through several changes as he processed this new reality. The smooth confidence was gone, replaced by the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. His carefully constructed power base was crumbling. His bought-and-paid-for sheriff had been replaced, and the woman he thought he'd broken was standing in his saloon, accusing him of crimes he couldn't deny. "This is ridiculous," Tolliver said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can't just—" "Actually, we can," Henrik said. "Town charter gives the council authority to remove corrupt officials and investigate crimes they failed to prosecute. And Reese, we've got a lot of crimes to investigate." Jack found himself in the strange position of watching his personal vendetta transformed into something larger and more complex. He'd come here to settle a debt of violence with violence, but Elena and the townspeople had chosen a different path, one that might actually succeed in breaking Tolliver's power permanently, rather than simply removing one man from the equation. But Tolliver wasn't finished. Jack could see the desperation in the man's eyes, the recognition that his carefully built empire was collapsing around him. Desperate men were the most dangerous kind, especially when they had nothing left to lose. "Lou," Tolliver said quietly, "kill them all." The moment Tolliver's words left his lips, time seemed to slow down in the way it always did before violence erupted. Jack had experienced this phenomenon countless times during the war. The strange compression of seconds that allowed a man to see every detail with crystalline clarity while his body moved with practiced efficiency. Born of deadly experience, Lou Brennan's massive hand was already closing around the stock of his shotgun when Jack drew his Colt. The motion so smooth and fast that most of the room's occupants didn't register it until the revolver was already leveled at the big man's chest. But Jack didn't fire, not yet. In that stretched moment of anticipation, he found himself calculating angles and distances, weighing the lives of innocent bystanders against the necessity of stopping Tolliver's men before they could carry out their deadly orders. "I wouldn't," Jack said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "You're fast, Lou, but not fast enough. And your scattergun won't do you much good if you're dead before you can pull the trigger." Brennan froze with his weapon half raised, his eyes locked on Jack's steady aim. The big man was dangerous but not stupid. He could see death in Jack's eyes, could recognize the difference between someone who threatened violence and someone who delivered it with professional efficiency. But Castellanos was a different story. The smaller man had always fancied himself a gunfighter, had cultivated a reputation for speed that served him well against drunk cowboys and frightened storekeepers. Facing down a legend like Cutter Jack should have given him pause, but desperation and alcohol had clouded his judgment. His hand dropped toward his gun with the quick, nervous motion of a man who thought speed could overcome skill. He was wrong. Jack's second shot, because there had been a first, though most people in the room would swear later they'd only heard one, took Castellanos in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his unfired weapon clattering across the floor. The man hit the ground hard, clutching his wounded arm and screaming curses that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush. The first shot had been for Brennan, who, despite Jack's warning, had continued reaching for his shotgun. That bullet had shattered the big man's collarbone and dropped him like a felled tree. His weapon still unfired and useless beside his motionless form. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered from the crowd, and Jack realized it was Henrik, staring at the two fallen men with the wide-eyed amazement of someone who had just witnessed something beyond his experience. I've never seen anyone move that fast, but Jack wasn't finished. Even as gunsmoke drifted toward the ceiling, his attention was fixed on Tolliver, who had gone pale as winter snow and was backing slowly toward the stairs. The man's hand was moving toward his coat pocket, where Jack had spotted the outline of a derringer during their conversation. "Don't," Jack said, swinging his aim toward Tolliver without ever taking his eyes off the man's face. "You've got one chance to surrender peacefully. After that, I stopped being polite about this." Tolliver's hand froze inches from his hidden weapon. Around the room, other men who had been reaching for guns suddenly found themselves reconsidering their loyalties. Tolliver might pay their wages, but wages weren't much good to a dead man. "This is murder," Tolliver said, his cultured voice cracking with strain. "You can't just gun down innocent men in cold blood." "Innocent?" Elena's voice carried a bitter laugh as she stepped further into the room, her own revolver drawn and pointed at the floor, but ready to rise if needed. "Tell that to Sarah Collins's mother or the Murphy girl's father. Tell that to every woman in this town who's been afraid to walk alone after dark because of you and your animals." Henrik moved closer to the fallen men, his new sheriff's badge catching the lamplight. "Lou's alive, but hurt bad. Jim's bleeding, but he'll live if we get him to the doctor." He looked up at Jack with something like awe. "I've heard stories about you, Mr. Cutler, but I never believed them until now." "Stories have a way of growing in the telling," Jack said, though he kept his gun trained on Tolliver. "What matters is that your town's problem is almost solved." But even as he spoke, Jack's mind was working through the larger implications of what had just happened. Killing Tolliver's enforcers was one thing. They were known criminals who had chosen their path. But Tolliver himself was another matter entirely. The man was despicable, but he was also a businessman with connections that reached far beyond Copper Falls. His death would bring questions, investigations, possibly federal marshals who wouldn't be satisfied with frontier justice. "Henrik," Jack said without taking his eyes off Tolliver, "you said something about investigating crimes. What exactly did you have in mind?" The old Norwegian moved closer, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "We've been gathering evidence for months. Bank records showing money missing from accounts, letters from families of missing girls, testimony from women who were afraid to speak before but are willing to talk now that Morrison's gone." Jack felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. This wasn't just about Elena's assault. It was about a systematic pattern of corruption and violence that had been poisoning Copper Falls for years. The townspeople hadn't just replaced a corrupt sheriff. They'd been building a case that could put Tolliver away for the rest of his life. "You're talking about a trial," Jack said. "I'm talking about justice," Henrik replied. "Real justice, not just revenge. The kind that cleans house permanent-like and makes sure this never happens again." Eleanor moved to stand beside Jack, her weapon now aimed at Tolliver with steady hands. "He needs to answer for what he's done, all of it. Not just to me, but to every woman he's hurt." Jack found himself at a crossroads he hadn't expected. He'd come here prepared to kill a man, to settle the debt with violence as he'd done so many times before. But Elena and Henrik were offering something different, a chance for justice that would serve the community rather than just satisfying his own need for vengeance. The problem was Tolliver himself. The man was desperate now, cornered and facing the collapse of everything he'd built. Jack could see it in his eyes, the calculation of a predator deciding whether to fight or flee. Men like Tolliver didn't surrender gracefully, didn't accept defeat with dignity. They lashed out, tried to take as many people down with them as possible. "Reese Tolliver," Henrik said formally, "by the authority vested in me as Sheriff of Copper Falls, I'm placing you under arrest for assault, theft, corruption, and suspicion of murder. You have the right to—" Tolliver moved faster than Jack had expected, his hand diving into his coat pocket and coming out with the small derringer Jack had spotted earlier. But instead of aiming at Jack or Henrik, he grabbed Elena around the throat and pressed the gun to her temple. "Nobody moves," Tolliver snarled, his polished facade completely gone now. "Nobody breathes hard, or the girl dies right here in front of everyone." Jack felt his blood turn to ice water. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid, exactly why he'd wanted Elena to stay hidden. Now she was a hostage, and Tolliver had the advantage of desperation and nothing left to lose. "Let her go," Jack said, his voice deadly calm. "This is between you and me. She's got nothing to do with it now." "She's got everything to do with it," Tolliver spat, backing toward the stairs with Elena held tight against his chest. "She's the one who started all this, the one who couldn't accept a generous offer when it was made. Now she's going to pay for her stubbornness. And so is anyone who tries to stop me." Elena met Jack's eyes over Tolliver's arm, and he saw something there that surprised him, not fear, but determination. She was planning something, waiting for the right moment to act. But with a gun pressed to her head, any sudden movement could be fatal. "What do you want?" Henrik asked, his own weapon drawn but useless while Tolliver held Elena as a shield. "I want safe passage out of town," Tolliver said. "A horse, supplies, and 12 hours head start before anyone comes after me. In exchange, maybe the girl lives to see another sunrise." Jack weighed his options, calculating angles and distances. He was good, better than good, but even he couldn't guarantee a clean shot with Elena so close to Tolliver. One miscalculation, one moment's hesitation, and she would die because of his decision to bring her here. But Elena made the choice for him. With a sudden twist of her body, she drove her elbow back into Tolliver's ribs and ducked away from the derringer, just as Jack's colt barked again. The bullet took Tolliver high in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall beside the stairs. For a moment, the saloon was completely silent, except for the sound of Tolliver's labored breathing. Then Elena was on her feet, her own gun pointed at the wounded man, with hands that shook only slightly. "That's for Sarah Collins," she said quietly, "and Maria Santos, and every other woman whose name I don't even know." Tolliver tried to speak, blood frothing at his lips, but the words never came. He slid down the wall and was still, his eyes staring at nothing. It was over. The silence that followed Tolliver's death seemed to stretch on forever, broken only by the labored breathing of the wounded men and the soft whisper of gun smoke drifting toward the ceiling. Jack stood perfectly still, his Colt still aimed at the spot where Tolliver had fallen, every sense alert for signs that the violence might not be finished. In his experience, the aftermath of a gunfight was often more dangerous than the shooting itself. Men made poor decisions when their blood was up and their friends lay bleeding on the floor, but as the seconds ticked by and no one moved to avenge their fallen employer, Jack began to realize that Tolliver's hold over his men had been built on fear and money rather than loyalty. With the man dead and their paychecks uncertain, the remaining hired guns seemed more interested in survival than revenge. Elena stood frozen beside the fallen body, her smoking revolver still pointed at the floor where Tolliver had collapsed. Jack could see the shock beginning to set in, the natural reaction of someone who had just participated in violence for the first time. She'd held herself together during the crisis, but now that the immediate danger was past, her body was starting to process what had happened. "Elena," Jack said gently, holstering his own weapon and moving toward her. It's over. You can put the gun down now." She looked at him with eyes that seemed to be seeing something beyond the saloon's smoky interior, something that existed only in her memory. "He's really dead?" she whispered. "He's dead," Jack confirmed, gently taking the revolver from her trembling hands. "He'll never hurt you or anyone else again." Henrik moved among the fallen men with the careful efficiency of someone who had dealt with violence before, checking pulses and assessing wounds. "Brennan's unconscious but breathing. Castellanos is hurt bad, but he'll live if we get him to Doc Henley." He looked up at Jack with something like awe. "I've never seen shooting like that. 2 men down before either could get off a shot." Jack felt no pride in the demonstration, only the familiar emptiness that always followed violence. He'd been killing men for more than 20 years and it never got easier, just more automatic, more efficient. The skills that had kept him alive through the war and the troubles that followed were useful when needed. But they came with a cost that decent people couldn't understand. "Someone should fetch the doctor," Jack said, surveying the room and noting that most of Tolliver's other men had quietly disappeared during the shooting. "And we'll need to send word to the territorial marshal about what happened here." "Already taken care of," Henrik said, gesturing toward one of the townsmen who had accompanied him into the saloon. "Tom's riding out tonight to bring Marshal Crawford back from Cedar Ridge. Should be here by tomorrow afternoon." Jack nodded, appreciating the old Norwegian's foresight. Having official law enforcement investigate the shooting would legitimize Henrik's actions as the new sheriff and provide legal cover for what had happened. The territorial authorities would find 3 dead or wounded criminals, a room full of witnesses, and a clear case of self-defense during the arrest of a wanted man. Around the saloon, the crowd began to stir as people processed what they had witnessed. Some moved toward the exits, eager to spread word of Tolliver's downfall throughout the town. Others lingered, drawn by the morbid fascination that violence always inspired in those who lived safely at its margins. But most simply stood and stared, trying to comprehend how quickly their world had changed. "The women?" Elena said suddenly, her voice gaining strength as the shock began to fade. "The other women he hurt, they need to know it's over. They need to know they're safe now." Henrik nodded solemnly. "I'll make sure word gets out. Every family that lost someone, every woman who suffered, they'll all know that justice was finally done." But Jack found himself thinking beyond the immediate aftermath, considering the larger implications of what had happened. Tolliver's death would create a power vacuum in Copper Falls, and such vacuums had a way of attracting the wrong kind of attention. Other predators would hear about the rich pickings in a town without strong leadership, and they might decide to try their luck where Tolliver had failed. "Henrik," Jack said, "you're going to need help rebuilding the law in this town. Tolliver didn't just corrupt the sheriff, he corrupted the whole system. It'll take time to clean house properly." "I know," the old man replied, "but we've got good people here, people who are tired of living in fear. They'll step up when called upon, same as they did tonight." Elena looked between the 2 men, something new in her expression, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. "I want to help," she said. "I want to make sure this never happens again." Jack studied her face, seeing the determination there. The frightened woman who had arrived at his cabin, bleeding and broken, was gone, replaced by someone who had found strength in confronting her demons. It was a transformation he recognized because he'd seen it in himself years ago when he'd finally decided to stop running from his responsibilities. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Elena straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze with clear eyes. "I'm thinking this town needs people who understand what it's like to be victimized, people who'll fight to protect the innocent. I'm thinking maybe I've found where I belong." The morning sun was already climbing toward its zenith when Marshal Crawford arrived in Copper Falls, accompanied by 2 deputies and trailing a pack horse loaded with official documents and investigative supplies. Jack watched from the porch of Henrik's trading post as the lawman dismounted in front of the silver dollar, his weathered face taking in the bullet, holes in the saloon's walls and the bloodstains. On the floor that marked where violence had visited the night before, Crawford was everything Jack had hoped for in a territorial. Marshal, competent, honest, and experienced enough to recognize the difference between justice and vigilantism. The man had served with distinction during the war, had spent 15 years bringing order to frontier towns, and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who understood both law and necessity. "Mr. Cutler," the marshal said as he approached the trading post, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was respectful but not deferential. "I've heard a lot about you over the years. Some good, some less so. I'm hoping this situation falls into the first category." "I expect it does," Jack replied, rising from his chair and extending his hand. "Though I suppose that depends on how you read the evidence." They shook hands with the firm grip of men who understood each other, and Jack found himself appreciating Crawford's direct approach. There would be no political maneuvering here, no attempt to find scapegoats or cover up inconvenient truths. The marshal would investigate, reach his conclusions, and act accordingly. "Henrik Olsen tells me you were acting in defense of others when the shooting started," Crawford said. "Says Tolliver was holding a woman hostage when you put him down." "That's the truth of it," Jack confirmed. "Though there's more to the story than just one night's violence. There always is." Crawford's eyes moved to Eleanor, who was sitting on the steps nearby, her face still bearing the faded bruises from Tolliver's assault. "Miss Vasquez, I presume. I'd like to hear your account of recent events, if you're willing to provide it." Elena stood with the composed dignity of someone who had found her strength through suffering. "I'm willing, Marshal. More than willing." Over the next hour, Crawford interviewed Elena, Henrik, and several other townspeople who had witnessed either Tolliver's crimes or the final confrontation in the saloon. Jack watched the marshal's face as the story unfolded, noting the way the man's expression grew grimmer with each new revelation of abuse and corruption. 16 women over the past 5 years, Crawford said finally, consulting his notes. 3 confirmed deaths, 8 missing and presumed dead, 5 who fled the territory after being assaulted. He looked up at Henrik. "And Sheriff Morrison knew about all of this?" "Morrison was Tolliver's creature," Henrik replied. "Bought and paid for from the day he pinned on the badge. Any complaint against Tolliver disappeared into his desk drawer, and any woman who pressed charges too hard found herself facing trumped-up charges of her own." Crawford nodded grimly, the pieces of a larger picture falling into place. "What about Tolliver's business dealings? The missing bank funds you mentioned?" "We've got records going back 3 years, Henrik said, producing a leather satchel filled with documents. "Forced sales, stolen property, coerced loans that were never repaid." He was bleeding this town dry, one family at a time. The marshal spent the better part of the afternoon reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and examining the scene of the shooting. When he finally emerged from the Silver Dollar, his face carried the satisfied expression of a man who had found exactly what he expected to find. "Clear case of justifiable homicide," he announced to the small crowd that had gathered outside the saloon. "Tolliver was a wanted man in 3 territories, and his death came during the commission of multiple felonies. Mr. Cutler acted in defense of an innocent hostage, and Sheriff Olsen was performing his lawful duties in attempting to arrest a dangerous criminal." The relief that washed over the assembled townspeople was almost palpable. For years, they had lived under the shadow of Tolliver's corruption, afraid to speak out and unable to find justice through legal channels. Now finally, they had official validation that their suffering had been real and their actions justified. "What happens next?" Elena asked, stepping forward to face the marshal. "Next, we clean house," Crawford replied. "I'll be recommending that the territorial governor send a team of investigators to review every case Morrison handled during his tenure as sheriff. Any conviction that looks suspicious gets reviewed, any missing person case gets reopened. We'll also be freezing Tolliver's assets until we can determine what was legally acquired and what was stolen." Jack felt something settle in his chest, a sense of completion that had nothing to do with personal revenge and everything to do with justice properly served. This was how things should work. Communities standing up for themselves, honest lawmen doing their jobs, and predators facing consequences for their actions. There is one more thing, Crawford said, turning to address the crowd. This town is going to need proper law enforcement going forward. Henrik Olsen has done admirable work as interim sheriff, but he's got a business to run and a family to consider. The marshal's gaze moved to Jack. I don't suppose you'd be interested in the job, Mr. Cutler. The offer hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, unexpected and laden with possibilities Jack hadn't considered. After 15 years of isolation, was he ready to rejoin the world of responsibilities and human connections? He looked at Elena, saw the hope in her eyes, and realized that maybe he was. 3 months later, Jack stood on the porch of the sheriff's office in Copper Falls, watching the morning sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The badge on his chest felt strange still, a weight he was slowly growing accustomed to after so many years of carrying only his own burdens. But strange didn't mean wrong, and with each passing day, he found himself more certain that accepting Marshal Crawford's offer had been the right choice. The town had changed in the months since Tolliver's death, transformed from a place where fear walked the streets to a community where decent folks could raise their families in peace. The investigation Crawford had promised had turned up evidence of corruption that reached far beyond what anyone had imagined. Stolen land, murdered witnesses, and a network of criminal associates that stretched across 3 territories. But with Tolliver dead and his organization dismantled, the healing had begun. Elena emerged from the doctor's office across the street, carrying a small bundle of medical supplies that she would distribute to the families who couldn't afford to pay for treatment. She had thrown herself into the work of rebuilding with the fierce determination of someone who understood what it meant to be helpless and had chosen never to be helpless again. The town council had officially appointed her as an advocate for victims of crime, a position that allowed her to help other women find their voices and seek justice. "How's Mrs. Patterson this morning?" Jack asked as Elena climbed the steps to join him on the porch. "Better. The baby's fever broke during the night and she's eating again." Elena settled into the chair beside his, a routine they had developed over the past weeks. "Doc Henley says she should be fine, as long as they keep her warm and fed." Jack nodded, filing away another small victory in the ongoing campaign to rebuild their community. The Pattersons were newcomers to Copper Falls, drawn by reports that the town was safe for families again. Their arrival, along with that of dozens of other honest folks seeking a fresh start, was perhaps the best evidence of how completely things had changed. "Any word from Marshal Crawford?" Elena asked, accepting the cup of coffee Jack offered her from the pot he kept warming on the office stove. "He'll be here next week for the final hearings. Says the territorial governor is satisfied with our progress and plans to recommend statehood consideration for this district." Jack settled back in his chair, savoring the morning quiet before the day's responsibilities began. Seems like honest law enforcement and community cooperation make quite an impression on folks back east. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the town come alive around them. Henrik opened his trading post with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, while the new schoolteacher, a young woman from Denver who had answered Elena's advertisement, prepared for another day of educating the children whose futures looked brighter than they had in years. "Jack," Elena said eventually, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone approaching a subject they'd been avoiding. "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "Your cabin up on the mountain. It's been sitting empty for 3 months now. Don't you miss it?" Jack considered the question, surprised to realize that he didn't miss the isolation as much as he'd expected. The silence and solitude that had once been his refuge now seemed less appealing than the daily challenges of serving a community that depended on him. "Some things are worth missing," he said finally, "but some things are worth more than what you give up to get them." Elena smiled, the expression transforming her face in the way that still caught Jack off guard. The frightened woman who had arrived at his cabin bleeding and broken was gone, replaced by someone who had found strength in service and purpose in protecting others. The change was remarkable, but then again, Jack knew something about transformation through adversity. "I love you," she said quietly, the words carrying no expectation or demand. Just simple truth spoken between two people who had learned to value honesty above comfort. "I love you too," Jack replied, reaching over to take her hand. "Took me a while to figure out I was allowed to feel that way again. But I do." They had been married the previous month in a simple ceremony conducted by the circuit preacher, with Henrik standing as witness and half the town in attendance. It had been Elena's idea to hold the reception in the same saloon where Tolliver had died, transforming a place of violence and fear into one of celebration and hope. The symbolism had not been lost on anyone present. "I was thinking," Elena said, "maybe we could ride up to the cabin this weekend. I'd like to see where you lived all those years, understand what you gave up to be here with me." Jack squeezed her hand, touched by her desire to know all parts of his history. "I'd like that. Though I should warn you, it's not much to look at. Just a simple place where a man learned to live with his ghosts. Maybe it's time to put some of those ghosts to rest," Elena suggested gently. Before Jack could respond, a rider appeared at the end of the main street, spurring his horse toward the sheriff's office with the urgency of someone carrying important news. Jack rose from his chair, his hand automatically checking the colt at his hip. Some habits died hard, and vigilance was one of them. But as the rider drew closer, Jack recognized Tommy Brennan, fully recovered from his lung fever and once again making supply runs between the outlying settlements. The young man's face carried excitement rather than alarm, and Jack felt the tension ease from his shoulders. "Sheriff Cutler," Tommy called as he reined in his horse. "Got a message from the territorial capital. They're sending a delegation next month to discuss statehood preparations, and they specifically asked for you to be present at the meetings." Jack accepted the official letter Tommy handed him, noting the impressive seal and heavy paper that spoke of important government business. After 15 years of avoiding any contact with authority, he was now being courted by the same officials he had once fled. "Statehood," Eleanor said wonderingly. "Our little town helping to birth a new state." "Our town," Jack agreed, surprised at how naturally the words came. "Our future." As Tommy rode away to continue his deliveries, Jack and Elena returned to their chairs on the porch, watching their community prepare for another day of the peaceful prosperity they had fought so hard to achieve. In the distance, Widow's Peak rose toward the sky, its slopes holding memories of solitude and sorrow that seemed to belong to another life entirely. Jack thought about the hearthstone in his abandoned cabin, where he had once carved Elena's name beside his own in a moment of hope he hadn't dared acknowledge. Perhaps it was time to bring that piece of their story home, to build a new hearth where their future could flourish without the shadows of the past. Some ghosts, he reflected, were indeed ready to rest.